think this one was the one that was working.
No, I think this is the one that wasn't working.
Okay, welcome everyone to the second talk of the mechanism design session for the tutorial. Next speaker is Kira Goldner from Washington. She is a PhD student with Anna Carlin, and she works on mechanism design, especially for social good, and some online algorithms as well.
What?
Online algorithms?
Revenue maximization.
Yeah, revenue maximization, mainly mechanism design, yeah. She has won a number of scholarship and fellowship from Google, Microsoft. I'm not going to list all of them. Welcome, Kira. And
so in contrast to Balu's talk, this is going to be a bit different. I'm not going to talk about my body of work or a body of work from this community, but I'm mostly going to talk about problems that this community has not studied and directions where I think our tools would be useful. Okay, so when you think of primary applications in our community, what do you think of? Ad auctions probably is the first thing that comes to mind. Maybe the Spectrum auction for the FCC, eBay, selling cloud computing, all the type of stuff that we're used to hearing about, that a lot of the papers here are about, that Balu just talked about. We have a few other applications that we're known for, which are our primary social good applications. These include school choice, residency matching, and kidney exchange. But beyond these three, our applications are mostly restricted to auctions and not especially social good domains. So what I want to talk about is why there's a lot more to be done here, why there are so many other social good applications that we should be working on to have the sort of impact that school choice and kidney matching and residency matching have had. So that should be your takeaway after the talk. Hopefully I'll have convinced you that this is a very interesting area to work in and our tools will be useful. So here's what I'm going to talk about. First, I'll talk about healthcare and health insurance. I'll talk about 3 different problems, what's known from our community, and a bunch of open problems that we could be working on. Then I'll talk about online labor markets and matching platforms, a big mechanism design question, and all these other open areas. And finally, I'll convince you that there are also domains beyond these 2. Okay. So let's start with healthcare. This is what US health insurance looks like right now. So 51% of people in the US are covered by employer health insurance. What this looks like is that the employers create a market, they negotiate with plans, they decide maybe we're gonna offer 4 different plans to our employees, and the insurers submit prices and the employers decide on which one. So this is 51% of health insurance. 40.6% of health insurance comes from government programs, and these come from a bunch of different government programs. So first we have Medicare, which is care for elderly and disabled, which is paid for by the government. This is 14.7% of people. And this is broken down into 2 different programs. The first one is traditional Medicare, which is run by the government. And what I mean here is that the government is actually the insurer. They're the ones saying, I'm going to pay for your costs. The second is Medicare Advantage. This is a little bit different. What it is the government creates a market with private insurers and then pays subsidies to the private insurers for covering the patients who the government has promised to cover. So now we're dealing with private insurers, Blue Cross Blue Shield, as opposed to the government being the insurer. We also have Medicaid, which is coverage for poorer people. And again, this breaks down into 2 components, traditional government-run Medicaid, and Medicaid managed care, or the Medicaid exchanges, which is again private insurers who are paid by the government. Then we have the new ACA exchanges. This is Obamacare, Affordable Care Act, which is a market with private insurers that the government subsidizes that anybody can buy health insurance from. And finally, there's military health insurance. And this still leaves 8.4% of people uninsured. So this is sort of a picture of what US health insurance looks like right now. Also, I forgot to say, but please feel free to ask any questions at any point. Okay, so the motivation for all these, what I have in red, the private insurers creating the markets, is that competition is good. If we use a market with private insurers, then hopefully the quality will go up, the prices will go down, and health insurance will be better. That's the motivation, at least. But US health insurance is a complete mess. So first off, it's really expensive. In 2015, it was costing $10,000 per person for health insurance, which is pretty absurd. Also, many still remain uninsured. I said 8.4%. This is 29 million people, despite the Affordable Care Act. And the quality of care is very high variance. You have no idea what the quality will be. You have no idea going into anything what it will cost, what treatments they might end up adding on. And then your experience with insurance is usually that you get unexpected bills. Suddenly you get a letter saying they've rejected your claim. You're not sure if they should be rejecting your claim. It's pretty chaotic. And of course, there are typical problems that arise in insurance markets: adverse selection, moral hazard, imperfect competition, market power. We'll talk about these more later. So we've got all of these things with the US health insurance market that are a mess, plus the typical insurance problems. And there's this additional caveat, which is that health insurance is considered a right. So what's the setting that I want to talk about from a game theoretic perspective? We have a bunch of players. One is the payer, the person who's paying for the person's health care. So for example, in Medicaid, the government is the payer, even if they're not the insurer. Then we have insurers, which may be the government or private providers. We have health providers, so I'm talking about doctors and hospitals, and patients. And what are the objectives of these different players? Well, the payer, maybe they want to maximize the health of the patients, but they don't want to pay too much, but they want to give the patients choice, and also they want the market to be efficient. So I'm just sort of speculating at what the objectives might be. I'm not saying this is 100% true. The insurers probably just want to maximize their profit.
Just to clarify, payer could be the employer,
Yes.
the government.
Exactly. Yeah, employer, government, the person paying the insurance company for the person's coverage. It could also be the patient. Yeah. Health providers, maybe they're altruistic and they just care about patient health. Maybe they're maximizing their own profit. Not really sure. And patients want to maximize their health, minimize their cost, limit their risk. So here are just some speculated objectives of the sort of game we have going on. Okay, so what is socially optimal? Again, I'm just going to speculate at a bunch of different things that the socially optimal outcome might look like, since it's a little bit fuzzy and not super clear. So one idea is maybe every patient is served by the insurance company that maximizes their utility, where utility is value for the plan minus price of the plan. And also, there's some benefit to having choice between plans. They don't just want to be forced onto one plan. Or maybe it's that every patient is served by the plan that can treat him in the most cost-effective way. So this would be some notion of efficiency. Perhaps it's that patients are only getting care that they would pay for if they were spending their own money and didn't have a budget. So if their value is how much money they value the plan at, then they should only be getting care that makes sense here. Hopefully, insurers are not engaging in bad risk selection, which we'll talk more about. And maybe we want that the government doesn't have to inject too much money into the system. So here are just some things that we might look for in a socially optimal outcome. Okay, so the first problem I want to talk about is adverse selection, which is the problem that plagues insurance markets. Here we have two insurance plans: high quality insurance that is good coverage and is also expensive, and medium quality insurance. And along the bottom, we have patients ranging from sick to healthy. What's going to happen? The sick patients are going to choose the high quality insurance because they need it. The healthy patients are going to choose the cheaper insurance because they don't. What happens here is that the high quality insurance is not profitable now for this insurance company. They're serving all of these sick people who actually need their costs covered, which is not the point of insurance. The point is to sort of amortize among different people. So this is no longer profitable. So what's this insurance company going to do? They're going to become a low quality plan. They're going to drop down because they want to get the healthy patients and be profitable. And so what happens now? The same thing, the sick patients choose the better plan, the healthy patients choose the cheaper plan. It's no longer profitable for this company. So again, they become cheaper and so on. And so what we wind up with is a race to the bottom in quality because of adverse selection. Okay. So this is just the market for lemons theory from 1970 of Akerlof that says there will be a race for the bottom because the sicker patients will choose the higher quality. Yeah?
So why is high quality not necessarily profitable? You just charge more, right?
Yeah, well, if you charge too much, nobody will buy it. So you have to be cheap enough. I mean, there has to be a reason for them getting insurance, right? I'm being a little fuzzy with the details, but yeah. Okay. So this theory of the race to the bottom and adverse selection is based on the notion that there's some asymmetry of information. So the idea is that buyers know how risky they are, but insurers don't. That's what it is classically based upon. But that's not actually the setting that we're in. The setting we're in is that insurers know tons of information about the patients. They're collecting information about them. They have big data about them, but they're not allowed to use it because they can't price discriminate against the sick. So how can we use this information? We're not actually in the classical adverse selection situation, but we're seeing adverse selection. So how can we mitigate it using the information that they actually do have? Yeah?
Does this really happen? As in, a company can provide both.
A company can provide
An expensive, high quality.
Yeah, they can provide both, but the expensive plan is, the high quality plan is never going to be profitable in this situation.
I understand.
The other thing is that sometimes the insurance providers have the tools to essentially pick their patients as opposed to the patients picking by advertising to the people they want and disincentivizing the people they don't want. And so the same thing will happen where everybody's going to try and pick the healthy patients and everybody doesn't want the sick patients. So we still have this problem of what do we do with the sick patients to make it profitable and give them health care. Okay. So here's the first idea of how we can maybe fix this. We could just reimburse anything past some number of X dollars so that everybody has equal risk. They're bearing the same burden for every patient. So you're just going to transfer, the government will transfer to them the excess costs over X dollars, and they're going to spend X dollars per person. Okay, so what's the problem with this setting? The problem is moral hazard. Now that they're getting covered for anything past X dollars, they have no incentive to keep their costs down. They're just gonna spend as much treatment, make the doctors happy by spending more on the doctors so they can profit, and this is still going to be a mess and not good for the government. So we fixed the problem about which patients they want, but now we have this problem where they have no incentive to keep costs down, which is moral hazard. Okay, so how do we fix this? The concept that they use is called a risk adjustment. So instead of paying anything over X dollars at the end of the year, instead, we're going to reimburse upfront the expected costs past X dollars. So now, because I'm reimbursing the expected extra amount over X dollars, you know what the expectation is, and you don't want to exceed the expectation. So you should be spending exactly what is expected to be spent for this patient. Yeah?
What does it mean to reimburse upfront?
At the beginning of the year. So at the beginning of the year, I say, okay, this health insurance plan is covering you. I think it's going to cost about $3,000 to cover you for the year, so I'm going to give them $3,000 now, and if they exceed $3,000, that's their problem. As opposed to at the end of the year, I look and I say, well, you actually spent $5,000. Okay, I'll give you $5,000. So now I have some notion of how much it should probably cost to cover you, and I'm going to pay the expectation at the beginning and not reimburse at the end. Yeah, it's a good question. Okay, so I'm assuming that the government has some notion of expected costs to be able to pay the expected costs, but we'll get into that in a minute.
But that's a function of the cost of health provider itself, right?
Sorry?
This expected cost will be function of the cost charged by the health provider.
Yes, this is true. But we're assuming these are known and fixed.
So this is just like a healthcare credit.
Healthcare credit.
It's not really an insurance.
It's not really insurance because,
You're just paying some money up front.
well, the payer is paying the insurance companies up front. The insurers are insuring the patients based on their real costs. So the payer is liable to pay for the patients, but the insurer is still bearing the risk. So upfront, the payer is saying, okay, I'm going to pay you a subsidy because I know this person's a little bit riskier. They have diabetes, they have cancer, or whatever, and so they're going to use more costs, and I want you to still cover them. But I don't want you to just go crazy with the treatment, so I'm only going to pay how much I think they should cost, and then it's your job to try not to spend more than that as you insure them. Okay? Okay. So this is risk adjustment. The idea is upfront, pay the expected cost to the insurer. Okay, so I've changed this now to the expected cost instead of the real cost. So what's the problem here? The problem here is now that certain patients have a different estimate for the expected costs. The question was, how do you measure their expected costs? The government's estimate for how much they cost might be different than the insurer's estimate for how much the patient should cost. So imagine these yellow patients, the ones with the yellow ring, have a higher government estimate than the cost that the provider thinks it's going to cost. What are they going to do? They're going to target these patients. They say, oh, the subsidy is going to be higher than I think it'll actually be. I don't really care how sick they are or not. I just care about the difference between the government's estimate and my estimate and where I can get some profit. So now they're going to target the poorly estimated patients to skim off the extra profits. This is called cream skimming. Okay, good? Okay, so now I want to talk about a paper by Braverman and Chesang about how to do risk adjustment given that we have these issues. So here's the problem. We have n different patient types. Type I has expected health costs drawn from some distribution, Fi, P, when treated by provider P. Okay, so the costs might be different if the government treats you versus provider A versus provider B because they have different deals with doctors and it costs them a different amount to treat you. Okay, so there's some distribution for each provider and the cost is drawn. And we're assuming that type I is completely known and it's really drawn from this distribution, okay? Just for this model. So now there are a couple of different data sets. The first one is public data, which is samples of how much it costs to treat this patient when the government is treating them. And everybody knows this. This is just publicly known data. The second data set is called the holdout data, which is only known by the government, and it's just more samples from the same data set, from the same distributions, okay? So the government has some extra data about how much it costs to treat patients. The third data set is private data, which only the private provider knows because they have ways to gain extra information, and they have both extra samples of how much it costs the government to treat them and samples of how much it costs the private provider to treat them. Okay, are the three data sets clear? Okay, so our two players are the government and the private insurers. The government needs to decide what subsidies to offer the patients, and they want to minimize the treatment costs. They want to maximize their efficiency. So they really only want insurer A to cover the patient if it's actually cheaper for insurer A to cover the patient than the government. They don't want to pay insurer A too much, but their primary objective is to make sure that whoever it is efficient to cover the patient covers the patient, since different providers have different strengths. The private insurers, on the other hand, are going to decide who to target. So again, because of their ability to advertise, they essentially have the ability to pick the patients they want to cover. And their goal is to maximize their profit. Yeah? Explain, sorry? So public data and holdout data are the same types of samples. Public data is known by everyone, all of the different players, so both the private insurers and the government. Holdout data is only known by the government. So it's holdout because the government can hold it out and not reveal it to the private providers, even though it's samples from the same distribution. It's just more samples. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. So one thing I want to point out is that you might be thinking that maybe this risk adjustment problem, where they're targeting the poorly estimated people, would be resolved if we could just use better machine learning and have very, very precise estimates of the expected cost. But in this model, because there are these three data sets and the private providers have extra information, then there's always going to be this information asymmetry that means that even perfect machine learning on their data doesn't account for this extra data. So there might always be a reason that the private provider has a better estimate. So instead, we need to deal with the incentives here. Okay.
Just to understand, so these FPI distributions, there's no public information about them at all. The distribution is not known, the samples are not known.
So FPI, the sample, yeah, there's no public information, only the private insurer knows them. The government doesn't need to know them because the government is happy to reimburse the expected costs according to the government's treatment. If you choose to treat them because it's cheaper, that's fine by me because I want the person who can treat them cheaply. The problem here is that you know more about how much it costs me to treat them. So you can sometimes detect if I poorly estimate my own costs. Okay. Okay, so here's a naive proposal. The government can just set the subsidy, government is G, to be the expected cost subject to all of their samples. Okay? the problem here is that, say the expected cost, I think that this patient is going to cost $700 to treat from all of my samples. But the private provider, when using the public data and their own samples, knows that it's only going to cost them $650, and it should only cost the government $600. So even though they know that it's cheaper for the government to cover them, they also see that there's a difference between how much it's going to they pay to cover them and the subsidy. So the private provider now knows, okay, if the government covered them, it would really only be $600, I think, according to my estimates. But I'm not going to let the government cover them because I can get some profit here by covering them for cheaper than the subsidy. So now we have inefficiency because I'm skimming off the extra profits. Okay. So there are two types of selection going on here. The first is this illegitimate selection from cream skimming, where I'm trying to get profits even though it's not actually efficient for the market because of the poor estimation of the government. The second is the positive type of selection, legitimate selection, where I'm targeting them because it's cheaper for me to do so. This is what we were just talking about. If it's cheaper for me to do so because I know from my samples of my own costs, then I should treat them. The government wants me to. So there's both illegitimate and legitimate selection. So the problem here is how do we incentivize legitimate selection but not illegitimate selection? Okay, so the solution that they come up in this paper of Bierman and Chisong is that they should promise to reimburse the expected cost from the holdout data, so the data that the private providers don't know. But they're not going to actually tell what this subsidy is until after the fact. The reason for this is that the private insurers know that there's some expected cost of samples, but they don't know the samples, so they should use all of their own samples to try and estimate the subsidy to make their decision. Does that make sense? Okay. So the government's still a strategic entity here, and how do we know they're not lying about the holdout? How do we know that they're not just going to say, okay, I'll reimburse you the expected, and then after the fact they change their mind about what it was? So the solution here is that you can use an unbiased estimator and then penalize the government if it's too far from the samples that everyone else knows. Okay, so this is a huge simplification of what they do in this paper, but I just want to give you some sense for the work that's been done in our community about risk adjustment before using our types of tools. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about strategic capitation for now. So now we still have another problem that results in this, which is that I was assuming that you knew who type I was and there was some distribution of type I's costs, but type I isn't actually observable. Rather, what we do is we look at someone's medical records and we say, okay, they have diabetes, okay, they have high blood pressure. Based on these diagnoses, I think someone with these diagnoses has these expected costs. Okay, the problem here is that suppose we have some healthy patients with risky labels. So we have healthy to this side, and again, they have labels that are like, oh, I have diabetes with complications, oh, I have chronic high blood pressure, but I'm healthy. Even though I can be diagnosed with this, it's not actually interfering with my life and it's not a problem with my health. So now, what the insurers are going to do is they're going to target these healthy patients who have risky labels in order to receive higher subsidies. So we still have this illegitimate selection going on. Okay, so what they're going to do is called upcoding, which is where you take a patient and you label them as sicker than they really are. And the reason they can do this is because medical diagnoses aren't always objective. You can't necessarily tell exactly whether someone has depression, whether somebody has chronic high blood pressure versus just regular high blood pressure. There's no objective test. And so, because if their patients have higher diagnoses, they're going to get higher subsidies for them, even though they won't actually cost that much. What the insurers are going to do is try to manipulate the system in order to get higher subsidies when they're not actually spending that amount of money. Okay, so as a result, the insurers might pressure doctors to upcode their patients, or they might say, okay, you're a new patient. If you come, I'll give you a free physical, because in this physical, it's likely that the doctors will find all these diagnoses that you didn't know you had because they're not really interfering with your life, and then I'll get more money for covering you. Okay? So this is upcoding. Okay, so I want to talk about a paper that sort of deals with this problem. It's called Strategic Classification, and it's by Hart, Megiddo, Papadimitriou, and Wooters. And this paper is not actually in the healthcare setting at all, but I'm going to put it in the healthcare setting because it's actually very related. So let's assume in this setting that the government wants to classify patients either as high risk or low risk. If they're low risk, they don't get any subsidy. If they're high risk, then they come with a subsidy. So each patient is a point X in a metric space. So think of this as their vector of diagnoses. Yes, they have diabetes. No, they don't have cancer. And they have a true classification H, which is whether they're actually high risk or low risk. And they're attached to some insurer who wants the subsidy. So the insurer wants them to be classified as high risk. Okay, so here's the game that's happening. The government is going to announce their risk adjustment function F, their function of how they classify patients as high or low risk. Point X, a patient with a point X, can pay the distance between X and S of X, where S of X is some manipulated diagnosis vector, to appear as S of X. And then they'll get classified based on as if they were S of X, okay? So what they're going to do is they pay some cost, think of it as the cost to go see a doctor and change their diagnoses, and then they're going to get classified based on their changed diagnoses. The patient and the paired insurer will get a payoff of 1 if they get classified as high risk, so if they get the subsidy, minus the cost they had to pay to manipulate their diagnosis. And the government is going to get the payoff of, they want to minimize generalization error here. So here it's how correct they are on classifying the manipulated data points compared to what they actually are, the real data point. Okay. So what's the optimal classifier to maximize this for the government? In a very simple setting, so we're just dealing with a 1D metric here where it's free to move down. So think of the real number line. Maybe I'm a 7 in terms of riskiness, and I can move to 5 for no cost, or I can move to 9 for a cost of 2. Right, this is just the metric on the real line. So in this setting, a threshold function is optimal. And I just want to point out that this paper is not in the healthcare setting. It's actually motivated by spam classification or admitting people based on their SAT scores. But the point here is that some work has already been done on how do we deal with manipulated data, like patients who have been upcoded, to then properly do risk adjustment. Okay, so now I just want to recap all of this, which I called problem number 1, adverse selection. So we started with the problem that quality wasn't profitable. We tried reimbursing riskier patients. Then we wound up with moral hazard because they had no incentive to keep costs down. Then we tried risk adjustment, just reimbursing the expected cost of each patient up front. But private insurers had different data and estimates, so we needed to incentivize them to legitimately select and not illegitimately select. And what's already known on this topic is this paper by Braverman and Chasong. We also said insurers might upcode patients to get higher subsidies. And what's already known on this subject is the strategic classification by Hart et al. Okay, so this is just a recap of everything that comes of trying to fix the adverse selection problem. Now I'm going to talk about related open problems because there's a lot of work to do here. So related to upcoding, there are many extensions of strategic classification. This was just a very specific metric in a very specific setting. So, okay. So first we could try and specialize the parameters of the setting for healthcare using cost functions or priors or manipulability of features or feasible solutions that are actually specific to healthcare as opposed to just some general model. We could also try to use more general metrics and classifiers. We could also deal with the fact where the sample distributions change over time. So how much it costs to treat a patient should change over time. Also, the benchmark they're dealing with is minimizing generalization error, but it's over deterministic classifiers. So we could use a different benchmark like minimizing over randomized classifiers. And we could also look at multi-round updates between rounds. So think of this as every round you now have the ability to re-upcode. Every year you can go to another doctor and re-upcode. Now how do you fix the classifier? So there's all sorts of directions of how to classify given that you're dealing with manipulated data, which is very important in the setting because upcoding really is a problem. Perhaps some of you have even looked at your medical data and found a weird diagnosis on it that a doctor just slapped on there. Okay. There's also all sorts of machine learning related problems here. For example, how to detect upcoding and tell that somebody's been upcoded. Or, as I said, some of the data is subjective. Some diagnoses are subjective, whereas others are objective. You do a blood test, if it's in this range, done. Okay, so how do you correct for the subjective data? Should you throw it out or correct for it? Should you balance it with the objective data using weights? What's the right way to deal with this? And another thing is just selection of features. Which features are you going to use to decide your subsidies? Okay, so these are upcoding related problems. Yes?
Just about the promise. In this part of, I had a question about the promise that government makes.
Yeah.
Like, okay, there is some expectation that I'm going to withhold and I'm going to pay at the end.
Sure.
So this really happens, or it's a solution that the paper proposes?
So it's a solution that the paper proposes. This is not what's used in practice. In practice, what's used is there's just some formula based on your diagnoses every year. They announce the formula, and they just reimburse you according to the formula. So right now, there is no fix for upcoding, and there is no fix for the poor estimation. These are theoretical. These are recent theoretical works from our community that started addressing these problems. Yes?
One clarification regarding this payers distribution about the cost, like FG of I, which you were talking
Yeah.
about. How is that formed? Is it like, let's say government is the payer, in that case, does government uses all the test results, records given by the private providers, whatever the hospitals and all give the patient's record, based on that they do their assessment of costing? So that's a very critical information. Or the government has their own agency to evaluate, to check the health check of the patients, and based on that they build this distribution, right?
It's a good question. So my understanding is that the government has access to some of the medical records that have to be reported. Not all of the medical records have to be reported. The government also is the insurer here. So the insurer gets to see the costs. The insurer gets to ask for it. When they're covered by a private insurer that they're paying for, they get some of the data. When they themselves are covering, they get all of the data. They don't have like a separate agency to evaluate, but they are the insurer, so they get to see it. But also, not all of the data is revealed to them by the doctor. Also, the private providers don't have to reveal the data. And some of the features you're not allowed to use. So for example, you can't discriminate based on certain features, so you're not allowed to learn on them. Okay. Great. Okay, so now I want to talk about open problems related to the cream skimming that we were talked about before, the strategic capitation. So just as a recap, the government is announcing subsidies and insurers are targeting poorly estimated patients. So an observation is that in Medicaid, many patients don't actually choose an insurer. And right now, the government just says, okay, go with this person, whatever. So what if we could assign the patients who don't choose an insurer in a clever way in order to solve some of our problems? So each round, the government picks an unassigned patient and assigns them, and then they learn the government's cost for treating them. So here are some potential interventions that they could use. First, they could charge a penalty or give a bonus if the average cost for a random patient assigned to insurer A is higher or lower than the cost for the patients with the same risk score. So what's happening here? Maybe insurer A says, oh, I'm going to take a bunch of patients with diabetes, but they're actually taking all of the ones that aren't really sick. And now when I randomly assign them a patient with the same risk score because they also have diabetes, suddenly it's costing much more. Why is it so far off from their cost? It's because they're cream skimming. They're only looking for the actually healthy patients. So perhaps by randomly assigning and seeing the costs, I can detect if they're doing this illegitimate selection. Okay. Or I could try and provide incentives to get patients to switch plans to see what the costs are when they're treated by different plans. What happens to the populations when they shift between plans. Or I could try and update the risk score or partition the type space used for giving a risk score in a different way. So this is just some ideas for an open problem. I'm not saying this is a totally concrete problem, but this is a semi-concrete problem in this space. Okay? And even more open problems. So insurance providers do more than just cream skim. They're also dissuading sicker patients by doing somewhat sketchy things like dropping health providers or certain insurance services. So maybe I don't want to cover pregnant women, so I'll just, even though it's illegal to say I won't cover pregnant women, I'll just go and I'll take all of the good OBGYNs and say, oh, I'm not contracting with you anymore. And then when a pregnant woman looks at my plan, they will see that I don't have any of the coverage that they need, and so they won't come to me. So this is not currently accounted for. This is an action that we're not accounting for in the action space. So how could we detect or regulate or disincentivize this sort of behavior? Because this is actually a major problem. And this is part of how they're doing their cream skimming, is by only attracting the healthier patients and dissuading the sicker patients by getting rid of the good doctors. Another idea for an open problem is just combining these two things, combining the capitation, the better risk adjustment, with this disincentivizing of upcoding, because right now they've only been studied separately. And also, risk adjustment is very entangled with previous costs. So we're estimating how risky someone is based on how much has been used to treat patients in the past. So this is like a dynamic game where the insurers can manipulate it by spending more money on the patients, and then their expected cost in the future is going to be higher because it's based on the costs in the past. So how can we sort of disentangle this? Is there a way to estimate risk without using the previous costs? Yeah.
Is there any data on this dropping health providers? Say we categorize health providers into categories, and this category gets hit more,
So I just saw a paper like a few weeks ago that showed that this was happening. I forget what it was called, but I will check my email and tell you about it after.
Okay.
Yes. But it's like a paper from empirical economics. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay. Yeah.
How do you take care of the sampling errors?
The sampling errors.
Yeah.
What do you mean?
It's different samples you are taking.
Yeah.
How much accuracy? And if there are huge deviations, how do you correct them?
It's a good question. So you mean because of the
Wrong way of thinking of samples.
So right now you're not doing anything to correct them. Right now the problem is not what the actual costs are, but the problem is more that there's this illegitimate selection happening, and we want a policy that disincentivizes this, regardless of how far off the samples actually are. But we're assuming that we have enough samples that we do have some idea of what the cost should look like.
Just to follow up on this dropping health providers, right? So is it that they try to do this in a subtle way, or you can be like completely brazen about this? And are there any checks and balances for this?
I'm not aware of any checks and balances for it, but I'm definitely not an expert on this topic. But I know experts on this topic, and so I'd be happy to connect it to them or ask them or show you this paper. Yeah. Okay, great. So that was all problem number one, adverse selection. Oh, I already said that, okay. So problem number two is we have limited funds. The government only has so much of a budget to pay for healthcare. So suppose, for example, there are M patients who all need the same procedure, and the government has promised to pay for them, but they only have a budget of B. How can they do this? Suppose there's K hospitals, and each hospital charges some cost CJ for treatment. And a patient I gets a value for being served at hospital J, VIJ. Okay. Oh, I should probably be pointing at the computer. Okay. So this is the setting we're in. So we have a bunch of patients here. They all need the same procedure. We have 3 different hospitals charging $3,000, $1,000, and $500. So really varying. And the budget that the government has is $6,000. Now, if we just let the patients go to the hospital they want to based on their values, which maybe it's how close the hospital is or how much they trust the hospital, it looks like this. What's the problem here? The cost for the favorite choices is $11,000, and that's not in the budget. So how can we cover all of these patients, given that they're strategic and they're just going to go to the hospital of their choosing? So there are a couple of things we could do. One thing we could do is we could add copays to try and disincentivize them with money, but sometimes this is undesirable. For example, if we're covering poor patients, we're not going to ask them to pay money. We're covering them. Instead, we could just use a lottery. Yeah. A copay is when you pay part of the price and the insurance pays the rest. So if you go for a procedure and you pay $100 and then the insurance pays everything after that. Yeah. Okay, so one thing we could do is we could just use a lottery. This doesn't require us to charge any money. We could just randomly decide you get to go, you don't get to go. Another thing we could do is use wait times or wait lists or welfare burning. And so the idea here is that products are underpriced because we're not allowed to charge prices, and so lines are going to form. And by inducing a wait time, artificially, we can incentivize people to go to hospitals so that we can pay for them all. Okay, so this has been studied in many contexts, including non-healthcare, such as school choice, subsidized housing, immigration. Okay, so now we're in the same setting. We have this problem where we were spending too much. If we impose a wait time that says you have to wait 3 months to get the procedure done at the first hospital, 1 month to get the procedure done at the second hospital, or you can just get it done today at the third hospital, then when patients choose their favorite, it's going to look like this, and it's going to be within the budget. So the idea is, can we somehow set wait times in order to cover everyone in our budget, but we still care about their health, so we want to maximize their utility. That's the problem we're talking about. Okay, so this is known as welfare burning. I forgot a citation. This is from Braverman et al., provision after wait. Okay, so the problem here is you have some waiting time for each hospital that you're going to choose. You have an auxiliary variable, which is the quota for hospital J. So this is not the maximum capacity of hospital J, but it's, I'm going to decide exactly how many people I want assigned to hospital J, and this is the auxiliary variable that says that. And H of I is the allocation, so it just says which hospital is I going to. It's going to be some J. Okay, so the problem up here is this is maximize utility, because instead of payments, we have wait times now. So it's just value minus wait time for your assignment. Subject to incentive compatibility, because these are strategic agents, you should prefer your hospital to any other hospital. This one says that the quota lambda J for hospital J is exact. And finally, that since you're paying lambda J patients at hospital J with a cost of CJ, this should not exceed the budget. So this is the optimization problem we're trying to solve here. So this looks a lot like our normal auction problems, except for that we have our budget and we have, instead of payments, these wait times. And they're being factored into the objective function, because opposed to in auctions where the payments get paid to the seller and this counts in welfare, the wait time is just being burned. Nobody benefits from wait time. It's just something we have to use in order to satisfy the budget constraint. Any questions on that? Okay. So I also want to note that the wait times are not actually decided by congestion. They're decided by these quotas, which are coming from the budget constraint. So these are artificially imposed wait times. Okay? So down here in the corner, I have this example. We have 3 patients. They have 3 different values, 10, 7, and 3, to go to the hospital, which costs $3,000, and the budget is $6,000. So what we can do is we can impose a wait time of 3 days, and then this bottom patient won't want to go anymore because this exhausts his value, and so just the top 2 patients will go, and this we can handle this. Yeah.
So just wondering, who chooses this wait time? And is it like
So this is the mechanism designer, which in this case is like the payer who has some regulation power over the hospitals.
can the government choose the wait time?
In this model, yes. Is it realistic? We'll talk about that in 1 minute, less than a minute. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
VIGs are assumed now.
VIGs are reported.
But we are not talking about incentive.
Yeah, you want to be truthful, right?
Yeah. No, VIGs are known, but we want it to be truthful. Yeah, good, good. Okay. VIGs are known, but we want it to be truthful. Yeah. So they're still strategic, but yeah, we're assuming that it's known. Good point, yeah. Okay. Okay, so one potential response might be that it's not reasonable to dictate waiting times. Who would dictate times? Just like it's not reasonable to dictate prices in a market if it's not regulated, okay? And so what they uncover in this paper by Braverman et al. Is that the optimal prior free deterministic prices are the VCG prices, and these arise endogenously via queue formation. So think ascending auctions. When you can just run an ascending auction and the prices emerge, you can run a queue formation and the wait times emerge. Okay? So you're right, it's not good to dictate wait times, but a nice thing about this paper is that they show that you don't have to, they would arise endogenously. Okay. So this relates to, I've been calling it welfare burning, but this relates to the concept known as money burning, which is in this paper by Hartline and Tim Roughgarden in 2009, where they completely solve the single parameter case optimally. And they come up with this very nice Meyersohnian-like theory, which uses parallels to revenue maximization, where they have these virtual valuation functions, just like in Meyerson, except for they're different virtual valuation functions. And they have ironing, just like in Meyerson, but it's a different type of ironing. So they have this nice Meyersohnian-like theory of how to optimally solve this money-burning objective, but things are a bit different here. And the resulting mechanism is, of course, different. So what's the optimal utility for one hospital? It's achieved by the following menu. Either you can wait a long time and be served with certainty, or you can wait a short time and then get a lottery, be served with some probability, or you just don't wait. Yes?
Here, what will be served with some problem?
So
You're talking about the money button.
yeah. So I'm going to flip a coin and decide who gets to have the procedure at the hospital. What?
What if the coin toss says I don't get the procedure?
Yeah, then you don't get the procedure. Not everybody is getting served in this one. Yeah. I mean, if it's not feasible to serve everyone, then it's not feasible to serve everyone. You can't exceed the budget. Yeah. Okay. So this is like this beautiful theory that is very similar to auction design that solves this problem in the single parameter setting. Okay, but there's all sorts of open problems here. For example, this was just restricted to deterministic mechanisms. What's the optimal randomized mechanism for the waiting time, not for the single parameter? We know that. What's the optimal utility given a budget? What are simple or reasonable mechanisms if the optimal ones are crazy? And what if we are allowed to use copays, but we don't want the copays to be too high, so we need to do copays and time with some sort of trade-off between the two? I also want to note that in this model, patients implicitly had equal utility for wait times. So every patient felt the same about time, and it affected them the same. So what are the alternatives to this? Is there some trade-off between time and money, because we're just assuming that your value is sort of, like, what is your value? Is it money? Is it time? And how do we incorporate ethical preferences? So maybe some people should get priority based on their age or something. How do we incorporate these preferences into such mechanisms, as opposed to treating everybody equally? Okay. So I think that this is a really nice area. This is what I'm really interested in right now and currently working on, and I'm very happy to talk about this offline because I think it's a really exciting area where we can really use our techniques from those of us who love revenue maximization, since there's a similar type theory here. Okay, so the third problem I want to talk about is consolidation. So this is a picture of the Affordable Care Act exchanges, and everything but the few green states has at most 4 providers in the county. And all of the red states only have 1 insurance provider in the ACA exchange. So if you are getting healthcare from the ACA exchange, you have very little choice. And what this means is that the prices are high, the quality is low, all the things that happen when we don't have sufficient competition. Okay? So this is a huge problem. You've probably heard people complaining about how the ACA exchanges don't work, and there's very few players in the markets. But it's not just the ACA exchanges. This is a picture of Medicare Advantage in 2015, and basically the market power taken by the 3 highest providers is shown. Okay, the only state where the 3 highest providers make up less than 50% of the market share is this state right here, New York, and all of the orange ones are making up more than 90%. So consolidation is a very big issue right now.
This is market share of how many?
The top 3, yeah.
That is 3 is competition.
3 is competitive. I mean, compared to 1 it is, but it's not very competitive.
So there is some theory that says the ideal number is 4. So it's not like
What is this from?
this is folklore I've heard from economists.
Okay.
In such market that we have service providers, the ideal number of companies is 4.
I see.
You don't want too many either. So 3 doesn't seem that bad.
But although in some of these states, I grew up in Kentucky, in some of these states and some of these counties, it's like 1 or 2, which is maybe bad. Yeah.
Okay. Well,
You know, we tend to think of complex.
Yeah, perhaps maybe 4 is good, but consolidation is a problem, and it's a problem in that they're dictating the market right now because there's so little competition. Okay. So where is this coming from? It's coming from barriers to entry. So if you're a new insurance provider arriving and you want to join the insurance market, you need to set up contracts with health providers. You need to hire professionals to review the claims, manage the care, and these are very large costs. And you need to negotiate low payment rates with health providers. And this in particular is very difficult for newer small insurers because they like to give breaks to the larger companies. And so you have all of these huge costs, which creates a problem where you have returns to scale, but you can't get into the market because of these barriers to entry. Okay. So the solution is perhaps regulation. So this is a regulated market. The government is regulating the market. They have the power. And in employer-sponsored insurance, the employer is regulating the market. They're negotiating with plans and only allowing 3 or 4 plans for their employees. But in the ACA exchanges or Medicaid exchanges, nothing is being regulated currently. There's no regulation, even though there is a centralized regulator. So I'm saying perhaps we can use our mechanism design tools to use the power of the regulator to fix this problem. So could the market regulator limit the entry or design some sort of procurement auction for the insurance plans or regulate the barriers to entry in order to have lower prices or better welfare for the participants or include some choice still? So this is just like a high-level fuzzy question. So one specific model from a project I'm currently working on, just to be a little bit more concrete, and there could be many models here, is that maybe for each plan J, the insurer has some cost of how much it actually costs them in expectation to offer this plan, and the patient has some value VIJ for plan J, and the insurer is going to submit a premium, so this is like a bid of how much they're going to charge the patients, PJ, to the regulator. And then the regulator is going to run some sort of mechanism in order to decide which plans get to stay in the market. So maybe the mechanism could be, I will take the 3 best plans that maximize welfare, or maybe it could just be, I'll take any number of plans that maximize welfare. So my point is just there's a mechanism design problem here. Okay. Some last thoughts on healthcare open problems before I switch gears. One is optimal MDP design. So assume you have a Markov decision process, and each state is a state of health. Each transition is some treatment, and the treatment has some associated cost. And then when you take a treatment, you randomly, according to some probabilities, wind up in a different state of health. If you know this MDP, if you were given this MDP, what's the optimal policy? What should you do here? What if you want to incentivize providers to do a certain thing other than another? So there might be some nice MDP problems here. Another question is, how do hospitals set prices? So in practice, there's sort of a strange thing going on right now. Providers set this, what I'm calling the retail price, that's not the official name or anything, which is this massive price on how much they're going to charge for a procedure. The reason they do this is because when the government pays for Medicaid patients or whatever, they pay some fixed price that the government dictates. They say, I'm only going to pay $300 for this procedure at this hospital based on its location, and you have to accept it. And the insurers need to be able to say that they got a good deal. So insurers negotiate a low price. So maybe the insurer wants to say, I'm only paying 50% of the retail price. And so what happens is there are these artificial retail prices that are extremely high so the insurers can say they got a good deal and to account for the fact that the government is paying a much lower price. And what happens is that the occasional unlucky person who doesn't have insurance gets stuck with the retail price. But a lot of the time, the person who can't pay the retail price, and then the hospital goes into debt. And where does the money to bail them out come from? Often it comes from the government. So the question is there's some problem here of how to set the retail price, how to fix this system so that it's not such a mess. Okay, so another problem is measuring quality of care. There are some aspects to it that are complex, like the fact that care is multidimensional. How long did it take? How did you have to come back to the hospital? There are all these different features. And also there's bias selection because the sickest patients tend to go to the best doctors, the healthier patients, less good doctors. So what would you do to measure quality of care? You can't just use something like Yelp here. There are nice problems in contract design for paying health providers. For example, there's this really nice paper by Bastani et al. That looks at contracts paying for outcomes. So it's called pay for performance. And they look at optimal contract design when you're paying for the health outcomes. So there are different problems here that I think would be really nice. There's also two different types of contracts that are usually used. One is fee for service. So this is, okay, you did knee surgery, I pay you for the knee surgery. Versus pay for performance, which is, okay, I came in with a knee problem, you fixed my knee problem, regardless of the service. So some sort of analysis between these two and the nice properties. Behavioral models. So this is something that Mark Braverman is very big about, which is that behavioral models are really important here. So maybe you'd want to consider a model where patients care about the number of outcomes that they saw before they were assigned. So maybe they didn't know about certain outcomes, and then it's okay if they get the best one they saw, but if they saw multiple ones and it got assigned something less, this would impact their utility. And also, I talked about the fact that there's subjective data and doctors can upcode, but maybe we could use something like auditing or second opinions as a tool in order to fix some of these things. So this is just high level, many healthcare problems. Okay. And finally, I just want to point out that Mark Braverman and Mark Shepard are two healthcare experts. There are many healthcare experts, of course. These are the ones I've been in contact with. I do not claim to be an expert on this. I've just been learning about it, and I'm sharing what I've learned with you, but I highly recommend talking to domain experts. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears and talk about online labor markets. Yes?
So I have a general question
Yeah.
on the medical insurance. So there's this Europe style or say UK style where it's entirely provided by the government. There's the US side, which is
Yeah.
private-public partnership.
Yeah.
Are there any studies on like which one is socially good or benefiting, or like, are there any?
I presume there are sociological or economic studies, but I'm not aware of any like economic theory studies or like the type of analyses that we like to do. Yeah, but that is, that would be one of the like big goals is, you know, prove one of these systems is better than the other.
And there's nothing.
I'm not aware of anything, no.
Your setting is only dealing with means when government giving some kind of subsidies?
Only dealing with the government giving some types of subsidies, is that what you said? That's the problems I've been talking about, yes.
No, it's only when the government giving subsidies, this model will
Which model?
this means insurance and all this.
So mostly what I've been talking about, like all the risk adjustment and upcoding was for that. The consolidation is for whenever there's a regulator in the market. The limited funds is for any type of payer. So the payer could be any type of payer that has like some sort of regulatory power. Yeah.
Many countries means there might be situation that government not giving any kind of subsidies. So in that case means.
So in that case, I would say that most of the problems I've talked about have to deal with either an employer or a government giving subsidies. So, because that's the other main thing that happens in the US. But you mean that nobody gets any, there's no payer? Just every person pays for their own costs? So no regulation in the market? Yeah, and that's not the setting I'm talking about. Okay, great. So very happy to talk more about healthcare offline. So now I want to talk about online labor markets to show you that there are many domains here to explore, even though I've gone on about healthcare for a while. So traditional labor markets have a bunch of workers on one side and some jobs are posted on the other, and the workers fill out their applications and they send them to the companies. Maybe this top guy only heard about the second job, which is why he didn't send it to the first. This middle guy happened to hear about both, but he only liked the top job. So there are different reasons as to why the applications are being sent different places. And so maybe what happens is the red job reviews the applications and doesn't like any of them. The white job likes the bottom guy. Okay, that's the match that's made. This is a traditional labor market. So what are the problems that plague traditional labor markets? First off, this is decentralization. You don't necessarily know about all the workers out there or all of the jobs out there, so it's just what you happen to hear about. You apply to each of them separately based on your search. There's a lack of information about the quality. So both the employer and the employee, because it's more of an experience good. So do I like this employer? I don't know. It depends on their policies, how they treat their employees, the type of benefits they give. And not all of this information is widely available. And also, typically suppliers of labor, so the employers have more bargaining power and better economic circumstances. So there's a lot of asymmetry in the market. So these are just traditional problems that traditional labor economists study. So in contrast, I want to talk about online labor markets, which is where we stick a platform in the middle here. And what this platform can do is they can add centralization, they can facilitate the search of finding stuff on the other side, and they can add a layer of trust. If you trust the platform, they're observing lots of things going on, so they add this layer of trust. Okay? So what are the advantages of online labor markets compared to traditional labor markets? Traditional labor markets are very poorly observed. We don't see anything. It's completely decentralized. People are applying. We don't really know what happens in the process. Maybe we see who's hired at the end of the day, but not any of the process until then. In contrast, online labor markets are extremely well observed because we can be the platform and we can see every part of the process. So we can see the job posted, all of the applications sent, the interview decisions. We can even see messages going back and forth sometimes, maybe not the text, but how many there were, who wound up hired, what the final terms were, how the contract progresses. We can observe all of this, which is very exciting for especially empiricists who want to study labor markets. We also have regulatory power. So for example, we can decide who can see what, and we can enforce pricing policies, and all the typical things that you get with regulatory power. And online labor markets are especially exciting to me because they have the potential to allow economic mobility. So one thing that if you talk to an economist and you say somebody is not financially well off, what could you do to help them out? You could allow them to migrate. That's usually what they'll say. And this sort of allows virtual migration because instead of moving to a new city with a better economy, you can work online and get a job anywhere. And also you can lower the barriers to entry because anybody can join the online labor market. You can be somebody who needs to care for a disabled person or an elderly person in your house. You can be a mother and you can still work without all of the other barriers to entry. Okay.
So you're restricting your focus here to where the job is performed online rather than the match is performed online but the job is.
It's a good question. That's what I'm going to call an online labor market right now, but I'm also going to talk about matching platforms where that's not necessarily the case. So I will conflate the two, yeah. Okay, so for example, now I'm going to talk about matching platforms in general. So there are all sorts of matching platforms these days. There is Airbnb, of course, TaskRabbit, which is the type of thing where you post the job online and then somebody comes and does the job in person. There's Uber and Lyft, of course. There's all sorts of dating apps. There's Upwork, which is an online labor market, and there's Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is also an online labor market. And so these two are going to be my focus for a good portion of this. Okay. So how does Mechanical Turk work? I want it to be very clear the difference between Mechanical Turk and Upwork. So what happens here is that requesters are posting microtasks for pennies. So very small tasks with very small payments. So a requester shows up and they say, okay, I have a task. Answer 10 image classification questions. I'll pay you 20 cents. And the question is going to be like this. It's going to say, is this a cat or a dog? This is what I mean by a microtask. And then a worker will show up and do the task. Okay? So then after this is completed, the requesters can look at the work and decide whether it's satisfactory or not, so they can accept the work and pay them or reject the work and not pay them. So both sides are anonymous. There's no screening because the requester just posts the job and then any worker can come and take the job. And the worker can't see anything about the employer. Okay? And also there's an extremely concentrated group of requesters here. So that's the Mechanical Turk setting. So Upwork, on the other hand, has larger jobs, longer-term relationships. So this is like web design, data entry, bookkeeping, longer-term regular jobs that you can do online. Yeah?
Extremely concentrated, being empirically speaking, that's the case.
Sorry?
It's an extremely concentrated group of requesters.
Yeah, empirically. Empirically. It'll come up later in the stuff I talk about. I just wanted to point it out. So Upwork is much more like a traditional labor market, but online. There are interviews, there's a selection process. Okay, so what this looks like is an employer comes and they post a job that says something like, oh, can you design my website? I think it'll take like 20 hours. And a worker comes along and says, I'll do it for $15 an hour. And maybe they go back and forth and the requester says, how about $14? And they form a match. Or it can start from the other side. A worker can post and say, I do web design for $15 an hour. And then an employer can come along and say, could you do my website? I'll pay $14 an hour. And they can decide whether or not to form the match. So Upwork is more like a traditional labor market, but with a platform. Mechanical Turk is microtasks for pennies. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is the search part. So who should they consider when they're looking for a match? So people are entering the market, and the platform is going to decide who can they see on the other side. Who can search? Maybe only one side can search for the other side. So for example, in Mechanical Turk, the requesters don't search for workers. The requesters just post the jobs, and then the workers search for jobs. In Uber and Lyft, no one searches. There's no looking for people on the other side. So you have flexibility here about the choice of who can search as the platform. How many can they see? So for example, in Coffee Meets Bagel, which is a dating app, they show you one per day. So you can say, do I show 1, 5, 25? How many people do I show on the other side? Do I let you search for everybody? What's the algorithm? How am I determining what comes up in the search results, who I show you first? And do you use some sort of recommendation system? Do I say, hey, I see you're a web designer. I think you should look for this job. Or hey, you're looking for web design. These guys are really well known for web design. You should hire them. And what are the effects of using one? So there's some empirical work on this that showed that when a recommendation system was implemented in an online labor market, where workers were recommended, workers really didn't like it. So as opposed to something like Netflix or Amazon where they're saying, hey, you might be interested in this product, and for some reason the product seemed to be okay with this, the workers really hated the recommendation system. And what are the effects of using one? Does it crowd out other workers? So there are a lot of problems here.
Is it because of the misclassification?
Is it because of?
The misclassification, kind of, they are suggesting some workers who don't want to do those kind of tasks.
It's unclear. So there's a paper on this by John Horden and possibly others, and so I would recommend looking at that. But my understanding is that it's more of like this is my livelihood. My work is my livelihood. Why are you recommending someone over me? I need the job, stuff like that. But that's just my understanding. Okay, so I'm just trying to illustrate how many different choices we have just when we're deciding on how to do search as the platform. Okay, but there's many more stages to the process. So now we've decided who they can see on the other side, but we can also decide how they can evaluate the other side. So this is screening. So what can they look at about the other side before deciding? How much interviewing do we allow? Do we allow them to talk back and forth, or is it just one interaction? How does proposing work? Can both sides propose, only one side? Do we force auto-accepting like Uber does? And then there are costs associated with each of this. It costs something to screen someone. It costs something to search. And do we inflate or subsidize these costs in order to modify the process? So there are all these different levers we can pull. This is a mechanism design problem. What are the choices we should make to optimize our objectives? So I'm just going to illustrate the process I just said. So here we have workers on the left, employers on the right. Somebody shows up, this guy right here. First we have search. So we say we show him 4 people. Then we have screening. He evaluates the 4 employers that he's been shown, and he decides, I don't really like the top one. So that guy's out. So now he has 3 people he's looking at. The other side screens 2, and maybe the bottom guy says, I don't really like this employee, so he's out. So now there's still 2 potential matches. And now there's interviewing. Maybe they send some messages back and forth, and they decide they're still interested. And there's proposing. So the worker applies for the job by the top guy, and the bottom guy offers a job, and then there's the accept-reject process. So maybe the top guy decides, no, I don't accept your job application. He's out of the process, and then the worker says, okay, I'll take the job from this other employer. So I'm just illustrating the parts of this process where we have control over every part of it. Okay. And also we can, as I said, look at the cost for each and inflate or subsidize them. So here are some examples of different mechanisms that are used in practice. So one possibility is just let one side search and propose, but both sides can screen. So this is like what happens in Airbnb. Or we can say one side does all the search, screening, and proposing, and the other one has to auto-accept. So this is like Airbnb Instant Book, where they just post their property and they don't get any say in the matter. If somebody wants to book it, they can. Or Mechanical Turk, where the requesters are just posting their jobs. Okay, also we could have both sides searching and screening and proposing. So this is like Upwork or the dating apps. Or we could just have auto match with no search, screening, and proposing, and this is what happens in Uber and Lyft. So my point is that there are all these different choices, and we're seeing a lot of different ones in practice. So what is known on this? I just want to highlight 3 works. The most related, I would say, is this facilitating search paper by Yash Kanoria and Daniela Seban. And what they conclude is that one side of the market, the short side of the market, proposing, and the long side not proposing, is more efficient for welfare, and both sides screen. So the interventions they look at are not allowing sides to propose or not allowing sides to screen, and they decide allow both sides to screen, only allowed one side of the market to propose, then it will encourage screening, which is good for welfare. Another paper here is about information acquisition costs. So this is sort of like a Pandora's box model. And what they conclude is that iterative admission cutoffs with tentative placeholders are good for regret-free stable matching. So what do I mean here? This is the setting here is school choice. The schools decide anybody above this level of quality can apply to me. So I'm essentially holding a spot for them. And if they can tentatively take it and then change their mind later on, so it's sort of like deferred acceptance. And then I can change my threshold later on and lower it if I'm not getting enough people as the school. And so this mechanism is good for a concept they call regret-free stable matching, which I can talk more about offline, or you can ask Nicole since she'll be around. And also there's this paper, Communication Requirements and Informative Signaling by Schlage et al. That says essentially signaling workers who have a high drawn value and using a qualification cutoff is good for communication. So these are the only 3 papers I know that are really related to this setting from our community. And especially for these bottom 2, I'm not really taking their point of the paper, I'm taking my point of the paper with respect to mechanism design. So they're addressing some other question, and I'm saying the result when you're looking at which mechanism should I use looks like this. Okay, so what are open problems in this area? We can just look at what is optimal or approximately optimal mechanism design for various objectives. So maybe we want to maximize welfare gains from trade if we're in a model where these things are known. Maybe we just want to say work is done better or faster, or we want to say there's high feedback in ratings, or we use the question of would you hire this person again? So something I heard from a domain expert is that if you want to implement this sort of thing on Upwork or Mechanical Turk, something you have a problem with is that there's no, welfare often isn't well defined in this setting. What is someone's value for an employee? They don't know, even if you knew everything about the employee, it's more of an experience good, so it's hard to say what your exact value is. So maybe you should use things that are more objective, like would you hire this person again? Why would we use one choice versus another? So I showed you all these different instantiations. We have what Uber and Lyft is doing versus what Airbnb is doing versus Airbnb Instant Book. Why are all these different mechanisms being used in different settings? So why have they picked these choices? Is it because of the objective that they're maximizing? Is it because of the distributions that they're dealing with or the underlying value model? What's going on here that we see all of these different mechanisms in practice? And also, what mechanisms have nice properties? So which ones have low communication or wind up in a stable matching or a regret-free? And is there some sort of overarching model we should be using given that there's all of these different matching platforms and they all sort of go through the same process? Is there some overarching model that applies to all of them? Because right now, as they're being studied individually. Okay. So this is what I'm going to say about mechanism design, and I'm going to focus on a couple other problems in online labor markets. One is information. So if there's too little information, we wind up with bad matches. For example, in Mechanical Turk, The employees can't see anything about the employers. They also don't have any work-specific information, so nobody can know if I'm really good at telling what a cat is, or if I'm really good at translation. Nobody can tell that about me, so it doesn't allow me to form good matches, because everybody looks equivalent to me. Lack of desired information leads to statistical discrimination. So for example, you're trying to figure out if an employee is going to be a good employee. Are they trustworthy? And often, they use statistical discrimination by saying, maybe if you're convicted of a crime, then you're not going to be a good employee. And then a regulator could say, I don't want you to discriminate against people who have been convicted of crimes. So ban the box is a policy that says you can't ask if they've been convicted of crimes. And it's been shown that what this leads to is racial discrimination. So sometimes when you forbid certain information, it leads to even cheaper statistical discrimination. They're using even worse signals that say, oh, I don't know if you're a criminal or not, so I don't know how to assess whether you're trustworthy, so instead I'm just gonna think that white criminals are more trustworthy and all black people are less trustworthy. This has been shown empirically to happen. On the other hand, it can help. So for example, there is an experiment in an online labor market, John Horton has a paper on it, where they hide the wage history, and this actually seems to help. So you can't see how much I've been paid in the past. The result is that I end up getting paid more. So this is good if you don't want to discriminate based on past wage history. Although perhaps this only helps because the fill rate of jobs is not very high right now. It's about 50% as opposed to higher. So there's a question of, should we prevent them from seeing certain information? As the platform, we have this control. There's also a problem of wrong information. So if I ask you for certain information, it may not be truthful, and then I'll wind up with the wrong information. So for example, John Horner and Ramesh Johari have a paper on eliciting the price sensitivity and quality trade-off. So you should say, oh, I really want something cheap, or I'm less sensitive to the price, I just really care about the quality. And you might worry that as an employer, if I say that, the employee will then bid up on me and say, oh, you're not sensitive to the price, I'm gonna charge you a much higher price. In their experiments, though, they show that this was actually working okay, that for some reason they weren't misreporting this. So why might that be? Why is it okay here? On the other hand, a major problem is that in online labor markets, especially Mechanical Turk, but in all of them, most of the jobs are being offered to a very small fraction of the workers. And so the problem here is if you're being invited to do a job, maybe you get 30 invitations per week, you don't actually have the capacity to do that many jobs, and nobody else is getting any invitations for jobs. Sorry, I said Mechanical Turk, I meant Upwork. And so maybe we should try to elicit the capacity to take on, but the problem is, just like in academia with job offers, the offer itself is valuable. There's something valuable about being offered a job here. There's something valuable about being invited to do more work. You have more choice. And so it's not truthful to say, oh, I can't actually take on this capacity, or oh, I'm actually going to only one school, or I can only take 3 job offers or something, because the offer itself is valuable.
Is it Upwork?
This is an Upwork, yeah. So how could we try and elicit this information, which is really crucial in order to actually get people to fill the jobs and equalize? And also there's subjective information. So as I've mentioned, this is more of an experience good, and so reputation is what's used. And so what's the right design here? So currently reputations for jobs are very right skewed. So even though Yelp ratings are a little bit more accurate, when you have like Uber ratings or feedback on an individual's work, they tend to be 4 or 5 stars. People don't feel like they can give lower stars when it's an individual and it's their livelihood. And also, where does it give market power? So for example, in Mechanical Turk, only employees have reputations, but employers don't. And only employers can penalize employees, but employers cannot be penalized. And as a result, this gives a lot of market power to the employers who are already consolidated. So there's massive asymmetry in Mechanical Turk. And maybe this could be fixed by not having a one-sided reputation system. Maybe it would be better to have no reputation or 2-sided reputation. So I think, even though it's just one bullet on the slide, I think reputation systems are like a massive area of work here. Okay. So I just want to point out these bottom 2 things are trust, and at the beginning I said that the major benefit of having an online platform is that they can help with search and they can add trust to the platform. So I think these are really big components. Okay, also they can regulate pricing policies. So for example, in Mechanical Turk, right now there's just ex-ante wages. It's just, I'll pay you 20 cents to do this job. And is there some way that we could have negotiations? Because the wages are way too low in Mechanical Turk right now. But how could you do it at large scale? Also, we could talk about hourly versus fixed contracts. So right now in Upwork, there are hourly wages. There's a lot of power in fixed contract work. For example, right now, less efficient workers don't do as well because there's an hourly wage. And so if there's an hourly wage and it's offered as higher, they won't get the job because I really should only be charging $2 for my work because I'm really slow. It's going to take me a lot longer than everyone else. Whereas it's fixed contract, I can build the website. It's just going to take me longer because I'm less efficient. Okay. Also, could you impose a minimum wage? So John Horton has a paper on this as well. And what they found was really interesting, which is that when they imposed a minimum wage, it actually went pretty well. There was mostly just substitution towards more efficient labor, although that does sort of crowd out the less efficient people, as I said, because if you're forced to pay $4 an hour, but you should only be paying me $2 an hour, then you're not going to hire me. One other thing that I think is really interesting is incentivizing quality. So this is a major problem in Mechanical Turk. There's really low quality work. And they've tried just raising the prices to incentivize higher quality work. But the prices are way below equilibrium at the moment. There's no shortage of work. And so paying higher doesn't fix this because they're still below equilibrium. So this is normally what the fix would be, but it doesn't work here. And so can you find some other way to incentivize quality? So there's a recent finding that says, maybe I can, if I give you some task that says, find the typos, and then I can say the top 25% of people who find typos get a bonus. So if I can offer bonuses after the fact, even though I have to decide everything ex ante, then maybe I can incentivize quality. And also adequate compensation. So especially in Mechanical Turk, workers are bearing all of the search costs. They have to find the jobs, they have to figure out if the employers are good. There's no information on Mechanical Turk. So in practice, what they're doing is using third-party websites to give reputations to the employers, and they're getting very low wages. So is there adequate compensation when you're bearing the search costs? So my point is that many of these things have been studied in our community before, but have they been studied at this scale with this degree of uncertainty or given the existing market power and information asymmetries? So my point is just we love pricing. There's a lot to do here with pricing. Okay, and just a couple of other directions. Onboarding, so how do we add new entrants to the labor market? How do we get them a reputation if they don't have any? Because maybe they can't get a job if they don't have a reputation. How do we evaluate or encourage upward mobility in the labor market? What if we want to impose some sort of fairness, maybe individual fairness or group fairness? There's been some work done on this, but there's more to be done. If clear types exist, how as the platform can we learn them and assign them efficiently? Some work has been done here. And what's the valuation model? What is your valuation for the other side? As I said, it's an experience good, and there's some vector of attributes that we know, and they're noisy information. What valuation model should we use here? What's the right model? And finally, reputation systems, I said, are a really big thing. What if we had competing reputation systems? What if there was an in-house Mechanical Turk reputation system and some third-party reputation system? What would happen in equilibria here? Okay, so again, I just want to say I'm not an expert. Here are some experts. John Horton is an empirical economist. I cited a lot of his findings. Also, Yash and Sidsuri are more in our community, and they have some really nice work on this. Okay. So lastly, I just want to say I've been talking about healthcare and online labor markets, but there is so much to do here. So remember, you're supposed to walk away thinking, oh, I should work on mechanism design for social good. I have the tools. I can have an impact. There are lots of problems to be solved. I love finding interesting open problems. Okay. So for example, here's a problem in refugee resettlement. Every community has different slots. So maybe as a community, I have 10 beds, 5 school places, 1 hospital bed, 4 jobs. And every family wants to stay together, every refugee family. And they also have certain needs. If they have students, they need to be in the schools. If they have someone who's sick, they need a hospital bed. And they have some preference over the locations. Communities also have priorities over the skills of workers and also the probability of integration into the community. And so how should we allocate? So this paper by Della Cortez et al. Basically says, they look at a lot of different mechanisms. One of the ones they encourage is this serial multidimensional top trading cycles, because regular top trading cycles doesn't work. This is a table from their paper where they're just comparing all these different mechanisms that have nice properties, Pareto efficiency, strategy proof, stability. So there's a lot of questions here of just what mechanisms should you use if you want to integrate refugees into communities. And refugee resettlement is a very big problem right now, as you probably are aware. It would be very good to improve the way that refugee resettlement is done, especially because if communities are happy with the way that refugees are integrated, they're more likely to take more refugees. And there are a lot of refugees that need to be resettled. Here's a problem in housing. So a recent finding says that in eviction, a bigger factor than the income or the wealth is a sudden shock to the wealth. So it's okay, like the problem is not whether I'm making $10,000 versus $20,000. The problem is whether I experience a sudden shock to my wealth and can't react to it. So here's a problem of ongoing work by Bebe et al., just to give you a model. So say as the government, you have some budget of funds that you can distribute. And each round, every family is going to experience a shock in wealth. So maybe it's a big negative shock, maybe it's barely any shock, maybe it's a positive shock. But every round, somebody experiences a shock. If you hit below a certain threshold, then you're evicted, which is a very bad outcome. There are books written about how once you go through an eviction, you have many negative effects and you can't get back on your feet. So we want to avoid eviction. And above some threshold, you escape poverty and you're out of the system, and you're no longer at risk for eviction. So in this model, which is just a toy model, how do you distribute the funds to maximize welfare? So here's just an example of a housing problem that we haven't solved yet. In education, we know a lot about school choice, but a recent problem that I think is really interesting is that school choice has lots of parameters. For example, the menu of school options that they show to students, the priorities that schools are allowed to have, and the quotas, how many places in the school. So these are different parameters of the school choice problem. And so how can we choose these parameters to optimize welfare? A recent paper by Peng Shi that was presented at last year's EC says that this just reduces to assortment planning, so we can use revenue management tools, which I think is really cool because, again, I think it's really cool and we can find these problems with big impact. This actually would improve welfare in Boston, according to data. We can use our tools to have an impact. So another direction I think is interesting is how should we allocate funding to schools? Should we use school vouchers or improve public education? Lastly, this is just a problem about diversity and fairness. Maybe we are trying to hire in a labor market or an incoming grad class, and there are different stages where you can develop skills and earn reputation, and you can pay a cost on your own to develop skills, but this cost is depending on your group, so your gender or ethnicity or something. And so maybe if you come from a certain background, it costs a lot more to develop skills, so where should we intervene along the process in order to have more diversity or fairness? Also, I just want to point out there are other talks that I would consider in new mechanism design for social good areas. And finally, the last thing I want to say, this is the process that I have decided it works well for finding problems. So the first thing you should do is learn about the systems in place and the issues with them. So you should read about policies, you should read work from economics and sociology because, again, there's not that much work in our community, which is why it's so interesting to look at this stuff. Then, of course, you should review the related Econ CS work and try and draw connections between the systems in place and what we know. And finally, the most important thing is to talk to a domain expert. Make sure we're working on problems that people actually care about. Talk to a domain expert, talk about the types of problems we're good at solving, talk about the types of problems they think it's really important to solve, and this is how you can come up with nice problems. So I just want to say I used materials from a bunch of people, and a lot of my knowledge comes from the fact that I've been co-running a research group with Rediat Abebe, who is awesome, and there are so many resources on our website at md4sg.com, so please check them out if you're interested in this or talk to us offline. And you can also find, these are the people on the market who are domain experts as well, so I'm advertising them. Okay. On what, sorry? Trust?
Yeah, trust in the systems.
Yeah, so I think like when we're looking at why online labor markets form or online platforms, yeah, the question was, can I talk more about trust? There was a slide on trust. So I believe that the reason that online platforms form, as opposed to just having offline decentralized markets, is to facilitate search and add trust. So I think these are two big components. The two things about trust I mentioned were in the slide about information. I talked about eliciting information and how it might not be truthful to just elicit information, so we need to do that carefully, because if we are posting wrong information, that's not good for trust. And the other thing I talked about was subjective information and reputation systems. So this is really crucial, is having reputation systems to build trust and good reputation systems of that.
But how do you quantify it? I think that's really what I was trying to ask.
Oh, how do you quantify trust?
Yeah.
That's a great question. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know of anything that looks at quantifying trust, but it's a very good question, yeah.
Okay, so I had one question. In the insurance part of your talk, you talked about the money burning.
Yes.
So the traditional hardline Rifgarden Marcionian approach says that you wait until some time, you may get a lottery, and then if you don't get chosen, then you're out.
Yeah.
In this health insurance scenario, can we do like you go to a lower choice hospital instead of getting evicted?
Right. Right. So
After waiting, say, not very long enough, but some amount of time, and it's like more like a hierarchical kind of scheduling than like yes or no type thing.
right, exactly. So the Heartline and Rifgarden was just for single parameter. So it's where we assume there's only one hospital. The problem with K hospitals is a multidimensional problem. This is the one studied in the Braverman et al. But it's still, I mean, whether people get served or not, you could still imagine a situation where just the hospitals are charging too much and you can't afford to pay for everyone, even if you have K hospitals, even if you're happy to send someone to their last choice by adding wait times, you just can't afford it even at all the hospitals. So if we're in a model where the costs are low enough and there are enough hospitals, there's enough competition that we can assign everyone, then that's the case. You're never just going to assign someone to their lower preference because it still has to be truthful. So you use this by inducing wait times.
Sure.
But whether you can assign everyone depends on the supply. Yeah.
And regarding the last part, so there is Uber and Lyft model where it's a contract is decided upfront.
Yeah.
No hourly or whatever, no
Right.
hidden cost.
Right.
And then there's Upwork and Mechanical Turk. And so are there any comparative studies between these two about like satisfaction, iteration rate, these things?
That's a good question. I'm not aware of any, but I would defer to the domain experts I put up on the slide. But it's a good question. I mean, and this is one of the open questions I think is really interesting, is why do you use them? Is it because Uber doesn't care about satisfaction rates as much? Is it because they think that the values here are not so sensitive, so it's okay if it's a little, it's a really good question why the different systems are used and where satisfaction changes. I would imagine if there is a difference in satisfaction that it's a lot more fraught than that and has a lot more to do about the information that you see in Upwork versus in Uber, because perhaps even though they prefer this matching system, because you're screening on information and it's fraught, then you are less satisfied, but yeah.
Okay, no more questions, then let's thank both the speakers. Announcement that Siddharth wanted to make.